The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. Picture this. It's March 1st, 1899, and an elderly scholar sits in an Istanbul hotel room, pen in hand, about to write one of the most prophetic letters in modern history. This is Yusuf Dia al-Din Pasha al-Khalidi, former mayor of Jerusalem, diplomat, and a man who spent his life watching empires rise and fall. He's writing to the chief rabbi of France, but his real audience is a Viennese journalist named Theodor Herzl, the charismatic founder of a bold new movement called Zionism. The letter is remarkable in its tone. Yusuf Dia writes with genuine respect and empathy. He acknowledges the terrible persecution Jews face in Europe and even concedes, "My God, historically it is your country." But then comes the warning, delivered with the quiet authority of someone who knows his homeland intimately. He points to what he calls the quote, 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 quote of circumstances, the most unavoidable circumstance. Palestine is already home to hundreds of thousands of people. It's not empty. It's not waiting to be claimed. His plea is simple and heartfelt. In the name of God, let Palestine be left alone. Just over 2 weeks later, Herzl's reply arrives. It's polite, reassuring even. Jewish immigration will bring prosperity to everyone, he promises. Economic benefits, improved living standards for all. What Herzl conveniently sidesteps is Yusuf Dia's central point, that you can't build a national home for one people on land where another people already lives without their consent. And what Herzl didn't include in his diplomatic letter but had scribbled in his private diary years earlier was far more revealing, a plan to quietly quote the penniless population across the border. That brief correspondence, over a century ago, contained the DNA of everything that would follow. It was a polite, almost genteel beginning to what would become a 100-year storm. Not a war between equal armies on a battlefield, but something far more one-sided. A colonial project backed by empires, aimed at transforming an inhabited land into something it wasn't. Today, we're diving into a remarkable book that reframes this entire history, The 100 Years' War on Palestine by Rashid Khalidi. Khalidi isn't just a distinguished historian at Columbia University. He's the great-great-nephew of the man who wrote that prophetic 1899 letter. This book is both sweeping historical analysis and intimate family memoir, woven together to reveal truths that have been deliberately obscured for generations. By the time we're done, you'll see this conflict through a completely different lens. Not as an ancient, hopelessly complicated religious feud between two equal sides, but, as Khalidi argues, it truly is. A continuous, century-long colonial war waged to replace one people with another, a war that could never have succeeded without the backing of the world's most powerful empires. This isn't just a history of a distant land. It's a story about power, justice, and the extraordinary resilience of people who have refused, for over 100 years, to simply vanish. Our story doesn't begin with gunfire, but with a society in motion. At the turn of the 20th century, Palestine was anything but stagnant. Under the sprawling Ottoman Empire, new schools were opening their doors, newspapers were proliferating, and coastal cities like Jaffa and Haifa buzzed with international trade. People identified with their families, their cities, their faith, and their broader Arab culture, all under the Ottoman umbrella. This wasn't some barren desert waiting for someone to make it bloom. It was a living, breathing society with deep roots. Enter Yusuf Dia al-Khalidi. Here was a man who embodied both tradition and modernity. Educated in Jerusalem, Malta, Istanbul, and Vienna, he mastered multiple European languages and developed a particular fascination with Judaism. He served as Jerusalem's mayor, as a diplomat, As a scholar, his life shows us a world that was cosmopolitan, educated, and interconnected. But Yusuf Dia was also a keen observer of gathering storm clouds. From Europe, he watched the horrifying rise of anti-Semitism and understood how it was fueling this new political movement, Zionism, which sought to create a Jewish homeland. At home, as mayor, he witnessed the first tension sparked by European Jewish settlers arriving in the late 1800s. With painful clarity, he understood that the Zionist goal of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine simply couldn't be reconciled with the rights of the people already living there. This insight drove him to write that famous letter to Herzl in 1899. It wasn't hateful or dismissive, it was a plea rooted in reality. Yes, he acknowledged the Jewish historical connection to the land, but he insisted that facts on the ground couldn't be ignored. Palestine had a population. Herzl's response established a pattern that would echo for the next century. He spoke the classic language of colonialism everywhere: progress, prosperity, mutual benefit. Jewish immigration would lift everyone up economically, he assured. It was a condescending assumption that Arabs could be bribed or manipulated into surrendering their homeland. Behind this public optimism lurked that private diary entry about quietly removing the poor population. The colonial mindset laid bare. The native people were a problem to be managed, relocated, or, ideally, made to disappear. This early exchange reveals the conflict's fundamental nature. As Khalidi argues throughout the book, this was never a war between two equal national movements. It was a colonial war against an indigenous population. Like colonial projects in the Americas, Africa, or Australia, it aimed to supplant the people already there. It justified itself with claims of bringing civilization to savages, as Herzl himself wrote. This was the thinking behind that powerful but utterly false slogan, "A land without a people for a people without a land." The people who were there simply became invisible in the narrative. For years, the Zionist project searched for a powerful patron. It struck out with the Ottoman Empire and Germany. Then the world exploded into the Great War. World War I brought unimaginable devastation to Palestine and the entire region. Starvation, disease, forced conscription into Ottoman armies. Khalidi shares his own family story. 4 of his great-uncles conscripted, his grandparents fleeing their Jaffa home to escape the fighting. His uncle Hussein, serving as a medical officer, never forgot seeing starved bodies lying in Jerusalem streets. It was a society brought to its knees. And it was precisely in this moment of trauma and weakness that the first great declaration of war was made against the Palestinian people. It didn't come from an invading army, but from a single paragraph issued from the heart of the British Empire. On November 2, 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour issued a statement. Just 67 words, but they would determine Palestine's fate for the next century. The Balfour Declaration stated that Britain viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Let's pause here. At that moment, Arabs comprised about 94% of Palestine's population. Jews made up roughly 6%. Yet this declaration promised a, quote, national home to the tiny minority. And the vast majority? They weren't even named. The words Palestinian or Arab don't appear. They're referred to only as the existing non-Jewish communities, promised merely civil and religious rights, not political or national rights. The Zionist movement had finally found its patron in the greatest imperial power of the age. For Palestinians, as Khalidi writes, Balfour's careful prose was a gun pointed directly at their heads. It was a declaration of war by the British Empire on the indigenous population. Britain's motivations weren't humanitarian. They were strategic. Controlling Palestine was crucial for protecting the Suez Canal and their route to India. Sponsoring the Zionist project was a convenient vehicle for securing imperial interests. The British government knew exactly what it was doing. In a brutally honest 1919 confidential memo, Lord Balfour himself admitted the hypocrisy. Britain wouldn't even go through the form of consulting the wishes of Palestine's current inhabitants, he wrote. He dismissed the rights of the, quote, 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land as mere desires and prejudices, less important than Zionism's future hopes. He bluntly admitted that when it came to Palestine, the great powers had made promises they, quote, always intended to violate. This policy was formalized in the British Mandate for Palestine, issued by the League of Nations in 1922. The mandate incorporated the Balfour Declaration, giving it the force of international law. It was an extraordinary gift to the Zionist movement. It explicitly recognized the historic connection of the Jewish people with Palestine. For Arabs whose mosques, churches, villages, and farms had shaped the land for over 1,000 years, there was no mention of any historical connection. It was a legal document designed to erase a people from their own history. The mandate created the framework for a Zionist parastate. It called for facilitating Jewish immigration and, quote, close settlement by Jews on the land. It established a Jewish agency with quasi-governmental powers, a body that could assist development and act as an international representative. Palestinians were offered no such body. They were consistently denied any real self-government, because the British knew that a democratic majority would immediately vote to end the Zionist project. Prime Minister Lloyd George privately assured Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann that Britain would never allow representative government in Palestine for precisely this reason. Palestinians didn't accept this quietly. They organized national congresses, sent petitions, held protests. Newspapers like Falastin warned of nation threatened with disappearance. But they faced not just the Zionist movement, but the full might of the British Empire. The situation reached a breaking point in the 1930s. The Nazi rise in Germany triggered massive Jewish immigration to Palestine, tens of thousands arriving annually. The Jewish population swelled from 18% in 1932 to over 31% by 1939. Palestinians could see they were on the verge of becoming a minority in their own country. This sparked the Great Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. This wasn't just scattered violence. It was a massive, countrywide uprising against British rule and the Zionist project it sponsored. The British response was utterly brutal. They deployed 100,000 troops, used bombers, and employed collective punishment, house demolitions, and summary executions. By the time they crushed the revolt, 10% of the adult male Palestinian population had been killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled. The author's own uncle, Dr. Hussein al-Khalidi, then Jerusalem's mayor, was among the leaders deported to the distant Seychelles Islands. Crushing the revolt was perhaps Britain's greatest service to the Zionist movement. It left Palestinian society shattered, leaderless, and disarmed. Meanwhile, Britain had armed and trained Jewish militias to help suppress the revolt. This created the military force that would prove decisive less than a decade later. As revisionist Zionist leader Ze'ev Jabotinsky had written years earlier with stark honesty, Zionist colonization can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall, which the native population cannot breach. In the 1930s, Britain provided that iron wall. As World War II ended, the global balance shifted. A weakened Britain could no longer hold its empire, and two new superpowers, the United States and Soviet Union, stepped onto the world stage. The Zionist movement, led by David Ben-Gurion, shrewdly anticipated this shift. In 1942, at New York's Biltmore Hotel, the movement for the first time openly called for turning all of Palestine into a Jewish Commonwealth. They launched a massive public relations effort in the United States, which, in the wake of the Holocaust's horrifying revelations, found a receptive audience. Zionism, once backed by declining Britain, now found a new and even more powerful patron in America. In 1947, exhausted and unable to control the situation, Britain dumped the problem into the lap of the newly formed United Nations. This led to the Second Great Declaration of War. The UN proposed partitioning Palestine. The plan, Resolution 181, passed on November 29, 1947, with crucial backing from both the United States and Soviet Union. It was a blatant violation of the principle of self-determination, enshrined in the UN's own charter. The Jewish population, about a third of the total and owning less than 7% of the land, was allocated over 56% of Palestine for their state. The Arab majority was given the smaller, less fertile remainder. On that very day, Rashid Khalidi's father, Ismail, then a young man, was sent to deliver a message to King Abdullah of Transjordan. Dr. Hussein al-Khalidi, acting for the Palestinian leadership, had asked his younger brother to tell the king that Palestinians couldn't accept his offer of protection. They wanted to control their own fate. As Ismail delivered this unwelcome news, a servant entered and announced that the UN had just voted for partition. Before stalking out, the king turned to Khalidi's father and said coldly, "You Palestinians have refused my offer. You deserve what happens to you." What happened next is what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe. It was the seismic upheaval that created the State of Israel and shattered Palestinian society. Khalidi argues that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine began well before any Arab armies entered the country. Starting in late 1947 and accelerating in spring 1948, Zionist militias implemented Plan Dalet. Its purpose was to conquer and depopulate areas assigned to the Jewish state, plus territory beyond it. Major Arab cities like Haifa and Jaffa were besieged and bombarded until their populations fled in terror. Villages were systematically attacked. The massacre at Deir Yassin on April 9, 1948, where over 100 villagers, many women and children, were slaughtered, sent a shockwave of fear across the country, accelerating the flight. By the time Israel declared independence on May 15, 1948, some 300,000 Palestinians had already been driven from their homes. When the poorly equipped and uncoordinated Arab armies finally intervened, they were defeated by superior Israeli forces. This triggered a second, even larger wave of expulsions. By the war's end in 1949, Israel controlled 78% of historic Palestine. At least 720,000 Palestinians, more than half the Arab population, had become refugees. Over 400 Palestinian villages were depopulated and subsequently destroyed to prevent their inhabitants from ever returning. Khalidi's own grandparents were among the displaced. His grandfather, then 85, stubbornly refused to leave their home near Jaffa. He only left when a friend ventured through the fighting to retrieve him, lamenting that he couldn't take his books. The family never saw their home again. Today, its ruins still stand, abandoned, on Tel Aviv's outskirts. The Nakba was the violent birth of the State of Israel. It was, as Khalidi argues, the only way an overwhelmingly Arab country could be transformed into a predominantly Jewish state. It was the brutal fulfillment of the colonial project. In the aftermath, Palestinians were rendered invisible. They were scattered, defeated, and leaderless. The remaining 22% of Palestine was divided, the West Bank and East Jerusalem falling under Jordanian control, Gaza under Egyptian administration. Inside Israel, the 160,000 Palestinians who remained were placed under strict military rule until 1966, their lands confiscated, treated as a suspect fifth column. But Palestinians didn't simply forget or disappear. In refugee camps across Gaza, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, a new generation grew up with the Nakba's trauma as their defining identity. From this generation emerged new, militant organizations in the 1950s and 60s, most notably Fatah, led by a young Yasser Arafat, and the movement of Arab nationalists, which would spawn the PFLP. Their goal was to put Palestine back on the map, to force the world to acknowledge their existence through armed struggle. These guerrilla raids from neighboring countries provoked massive Israeli retaliation, creating an escalating cycle of violence that led directly to the next major confrontation, the 1967 war. The story often told about the Six-Day War of June 1967 is of a tiny, vulnerable Israel on the brink of annihilation, facing the combined Arab world. Khalidi, citing declassified intelligence and even Israeli generals' own words, shows this to be myth. American intelligence knew and told President Johnson that Israel was far superior militarily, and would quote, even if Arabs attacked first. It was Israel that launched a devastating surprise attack, wiping out Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian air forces on the ground in hours. In 6 days, it conquered the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria. Rashid Khalidi shares a personal memory from that week. As a college student, he was in his father's UN office in New York. On the war's 5th day, the Security Council passed a resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire, as Israeli forces advanced on Damascus. But just as action seemed imminent, American Ambassador Arthur Goldberg asked for a 2-hour adjournment to, consult with his government. Khalidi asked his father why. His father replied with a bitter smile, "Don't you understand? The Americans are giving the Israelis a little more time." It was a small moment that revealed a profound shift. The United States was no longer just a supporter. It was providing diplomatic cover for Israeli military conquests. This shift was cemented in the war's aftermath, with what Khalidi calls the Third Great Declaration of War, UN Security Council Resolution 242, passed in November 1967. This resolution, largely drafted by the U.S. and Britain, would become the bedrock of all future peace processes. But it was a document designed to erase the core problem. First, like the Balfour Declaration, it doesn't mention Palestinians or Palestine by name. It refers only to achieving a, just solution of the refugee problem, reducing a national struggle for self-determination to a humanitarian issue. Second, it was deliberately ambiguous. The English text calls for withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the war, not the territories. Israel and the U.S. have used this linguistic loophole ever since to argue Israel isn't required to withdraw from all conquered land. Most importantly, by focusing only on territories occupied in 1967, Resolution 242 effectively legitimized the results of the 1948 war. It erased the Nakba, the refugee expulsions, and Israel's conquest of 78% of Palestine. The conflict was now framed as a dispute between states over the 1967 borders, not as an unresolved colonial conflict over the entirety of Palestine. Palestinians once again were written out of their own story. But 1967 had a paradoxical effect. While it was a crushing defeat for Arab armies, Khalidi argues that, quote, by defeating the Arabs, Israel resurrected the Palestinians. Facing neglect by world powers, the Palestinian national movement re-emerged with incredible force. Militant groups took over the Palestine Liberation Organization, which had been created by Arab states. With Yasser Arafat as chairman, the PLO became an independent actor on the world stage, recognized by the Arab League and over 100 countries as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. This resurgence was also cultural. Writers like Ghassan Kanafani and poets like Mahmoud Darwish gave voice to the experience of exile and resistance, helping forge a new sense of national identity. Palestinian reemergence was a major problem for Israel and the United States, which had tried to pretend they didn't exist. This led to what Khalidi calls the Fourth Declaration of War, the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon. By the early 1980s, the PLO had established a powerful mini-state in Lebanon, from which it launched attacks on northern Israel. In 1982, Defense Minister Ariel Sharon launched a massive invasion. Khalidi argues the real target wasn't just the PLO in Lebanon, it was the idea of Palestinian nationalism itself. Sharon believed that by crushing the PLO's military and political infrastructure, he could break Palestinians' spirit in the West Bank and Gaza, making it easier for Israel to permanently annex those territories. This war was launched with a, quote, green light from American Secretary of State Alexander Haig. It was, in effect, a joint U.S.-Israeli war against the Palestinians. Khalidi and his family lived through the brutal 7-week siege of Beirut. He describes the terror of the opening bombardment, rushing to pick up his young daughters from school as Israeli jets roared overhead. He describes the indiscriminate shelling that destroyed entire apartment buildings, and the constant fear. Eventually, the PLO was forced to evacuate Beirut. The United States, acting as mediator, gave solemn written pledges that Palestinian civilians left behind in refugee camps would be protected. International forces supervising the evacuation left as soon as the last PLO ship departed. Days later, Israel's Lebanese Christian Phalangist allies entered the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps. As Israeli forces surrounded the camps and fired flares to illuminate the night sky, the militias slaughtered more than 1,000 unarmed men, women, and children. The 1982 war succeeded in expelling the PLO, leaving the movement defeated and dispersed to a new exile in Tunis. But once again, the outcome was paradoxical. Sharon's plan backfired. Instead of crushing Palestinian nationalism, the defeat in Lebanon shifted the struggle's center of gravity away from the diaspora and back inside Palestine itself. 5 years later, in December 1987, a spontaneous popular uprising erupted across the West Bank and Gaza. This was the First Intifada. It was a grassroots movement, driven by a generation that had known nothing but military occupation. Unlike the armed struggle from abroad, the Intifada was overwhelmingly nonviolent, a campaign of civil disobedience, strikes, boycotts, and mass demonstrations. The iconic image was of a young boy throwing a stone at an Israeli tank. Israel's response, ordered by then Defense Minister Yitzhak Rabin, was an force, might, and beatings. Televised images of heavily armed soldiers breaking teenagers, Bones did immense damage to Israel's image as David facing an Arab Goliath. For the first time, much of the world began seeing Israel as a brutal occupying power. The First Intifada was, Khalidi argues, the first unmitigated victory for Palestinians. It made clear to Israeli leadership, including Rabin, that the occupation couldn't be sustained by force alone. This realization, combined with the PLO's weakness and isolation after its disastrous support for Saddam Hussein in the 1991 Gulf War, led to a new phase, the peace process. This began with the Madrid Conference in 1991 and led to what Khalidi calls the Fifth Declaration of War, the Oslo Accords. Khalidi was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation during the Washington talks following Madrid, giving him a unique insider's perspective. He describes a process stacked against Palestinians from the start. Israel dictated who could be on the Palestinian team and what could be discussed. The United States, far from being an honest broker, acted as Israel's lawyer, bound by secret commitments to never put forward proposals Israel found unsatisfactory. While official talks in Washington stalled, a secret back channel opened in Oslo, Norway. There, in 1993, a desperate and weakened PLO leadership agreed to a deal. The Oslo Accords were celebrated worldwide, with a famous handshake on the White House lawn. But Khalidi, and others like Edward Said, saw it for what it was. A trap. Said called it, an instrument of Palestinian surrender, a Palestinian Versailles. The Accords didn't promise a Palestinian state. They created a Palestinian Authority with limited self-rule over fragmented patches of the West Bank and Gaza, amounting to less than 40% of the territory. Israel retained ultimate control over borders, airspace, water, security, and the rapidly expanding settlements. In effect, the PLO had agreed to become a subcontractor for the occupation. The PA's main job, mandated by Israel and the U.S., was to provide security coordination, essentially to police its own people on behalf of the occupier. As Khalidi had feared, the post-Oslo years were a disaster for most Palestinians. Instead of freedom, they got more checkpoints, walls, and settlements. The economy withered. Gaza was severed from the West Bank, and both were cut off from Jerusalem. The interim period, that was supposed to last 5 years, has now stretched on for nearly 30. This growing despair, combined with the final collapse of the peace process at the 2000 Camp David summit, led to the Second Intifada. This uprising was starkly different from the first. It quickly became militarized, characterized by deadly suicide bombings by Palestinian militant groups, especially the rising Islamist movement, Hamas. These attacks on Israeli civilians were a strategic and moral disaster, erasing the positive image Palestinians had built and uniting Israelis behind their hardline leader, Ariel Sharon. Israel responded with overwhelming force, reoccupying Palestinian cities, and eventually laying siege to Yasser Arafat in his Ramallah headquarters until his death in 2004. The chaos and disillusionment paved the way for Hamas to win Palestinian parliamentary elections in 2006. This led to a devastating split in the Palestinian national movement. After a brief bloody civil war in 2007, Fatah was left controlling the PA and the West Bank, while Hamas took control of Gaza. This brings us to Khalidi's sixth and final declaration of war, the ongoing siege of Gaza. After Hamas took control, Israel imposed a crushing blockade, turning the tiny, crowded strip into what has been called the world's largest open-air prison. This siege was punctuated by a series of savage Israeli military assaults in 2008, 2012 and 2014. Khalidi details the sheer scale of this violence. In the 2014 war, for example, Israel fired nearly 50,000 artillery and tank shells into Gaza and launched over 6,000 air attacks, many using 2,000-pound bombs in just 51 days. This was the application of what the Israeli military calls the Dahiya doctrine, the intentional use of disproportionate force to cause great damage and destruction on civilian areas. It's collective punishment as formal strategy. Over the course of a century, the battlefield has changed, from London's diplomatic salons to Palestine's hills, from Beirut's streets to Gaza's refugee camps. But, for Khalidi, the war's fundamental nature has remained the same. It's a war waged by a powerful colonial movement, backed by empires, to supplant an indigenous people. As we step back from this long, often brutal century of history, what's the most important lesson Rashid Khalidi wants us to grasp? It's that this conflict is not, at its heart, complicated. It's actually painfully simple. It's the story of a settler-colonial project that arrived a century too late. It imported a 19th-century model of replacing a native population into a 20th-century world where such projects were no longer seen as heroic acts of progress, but as acts of injustice. The central pillar of this entire 100-year war has been systemic, intentional, and legally codified inequality. From the Balfour Declaration, which granted national rights to a minority and only civil and religious rights to the majority, to Israel's 2018 nation-state law, which declares that the right to national self-determination is unique to the Jewish people. The goal has always been to enshrine the supremacy of one group over another. As one Israeli lawmaker bluntly put it, Palestinians, quote, suffer from one major defect. They were not born Jews. This is the core issue. A just and lasting peace cannot be built on a foundation of inequality. Khalidi argues that any future solution, whether two states, one state, or something else entirely, will fail unless it's based on absolute equality of human, civil, political, and national rights for every single person who lives between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. What does this mean for you today? First and foremost, it means learning to see this story clearly. It means rejecting the myth that this is an intractable conflict between two equal sides, with equally valid claims, and instead seeing it as Khalidi presents it, a deeply unequal struggle between an occupier and an occupied people, a colonizer and a colonized people. Second, it means recognizing the role that outside powers, especially the United States, have played, not as neutral mediators, but as active participants on one side of this war. Understanding this is crucial to changing the dynamic, because as long as Israel receives unconditional military, economic, and diplomatic support to maintain the status quo of occupation and inequality, there's no incentive for it to change. Finally, the book leaves us with profound respect for the sheer persistence of the Palestinian people. For over a century, they've faced the world's greatest powers. They've been defeated, dispossessed, exiled, and divided. And yet, they're still there. Their population in historic Palestine is now roughly equal to the Jewish population. They've refused to disappear. Their story is a powerful testament to the idea that you can occupy a people's land, but you can't extinguish their identity or their demand for justice. The 100 years, war on Palestine has failed in its ultimate objective, to erase a people, and in that failure lies the hope for a different, more just future. That was the book summary of The 100 Years, War on Palestine, by Rashid Khalidi. We've certainly touched on the major declarations of war and the key turning points today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only ever be a map. The real journey happens when you walk the terrain yourself. The power of this book isn't just in the historical facts, but in how Khalidi weaves them together with his own family's story, making a century of struggle feel deeply personal. This summary is designed to give you a clear framework and help you decide if this history is one you need to understand more deeply. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity or challenged what you thought you knew, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's about understanding the world we live in today and the human cost of a conflict that continues to shape it. A link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable and it gave you a new perspective, please do me a small favor and hit that like button. And make sure to subscribe to Billionaire's Bookshelf so you don't miss our next journey into another book that can change the way you see the world. Let's keep learning and growing together.